The Shoemaker's Holiday by Thomas Dekker. The Shoemaker's Holiday or The Gentlecraft is an Elizabethan play written by Thomas Dekker. The play was first performed in 1599 by the Admiral's men, and it falls into the subgenre of city comedy. The story features three subplots: an interclass romance between a citizen of London and an aristocrat, the ascension of Shoemaker Simon Eyre to Lord Mayor of London, and a romance between a gentleman and a shoemaker's wife, whose husband appears to have died in the wars with France. The play is a citizen drama, or a depiction of the life of members of London's livery companies, and it follows in Dekker's style of depicting everyday life in London. The events of the play occur during the reign of King Henry VI. Plot summary: Sir Hugh Lacy, Lincoln, and Sir Roger Otley discuss the potential relationship blooming between their charges Roland Lacy and Rose Otley. The men discuss the class barrier that would be broken by the said relationship. Lincoln discovers the king's plan for Roland to lead an army in France. Roland arrives as Otley is leaving. Lincoln advises Lacy to enter the war in France and leave Rose behind. Lacy agrees, and Lincoln exits. Lacy asks his cousin Askew to go ahead to France without him because he has business in London. Askew agrees, but the two are interrupted by a band of shoemakers led by Simon Eyre. Eyre and his men ask Lacy to allow Ralph, Eyre's youngest apprentice and a newly conscripted soldier, to be allowed to stay in London with his new bride, Jane. Lacy refuses. Ralph gifts Jane a pair of shoes specifically designed for her and then departs. Rose dreamt of Lacy, her absent love. Rose's maid, Sybil, arrives with news from London. She recognizes Lacy in costume. Rose asks Sybil to ensure that Lacy has embarked for France. Rose promises Sybil expensive clothes for her troubles. Lacy soliloquizes about his plan to seek a job as a shoemaker so that he can remain in London and see Rose. Simon Eyre wakes his fellow shoemakers and wife to begin the workday. Lacy, disguised as a Dutch shoemaker named Hans, passes the shop singing a Dutch song. One of Eyre's apprentices, Firk, notices Lacy and asks Eyre to hire him. Eyre denies the request, but is met by Hodge, his foreman, and Firk threatening to leave unless their desire is met. Eyre eventually hires Lacy. Master Hammond and Master Warner, two wealthy men, are hunting deer on the land adjacent to Roger Otley's country house. A boy informs them that their targeted game has left. Hammond and Warner arrive at Roger Otley's house looking for the deer. Rose and Sybil say they have not seen it, and they have further discussion with the men. Otley arrives and welcomes the hunters. Otley later claims that he intends to marry Hammond to Rose. On behalf of Eyre, Hans uses his previous connection with a Dutch skipper to secure the purchase of a valuable cargo. Hodge explains that Eyre stands to make a lot of money when he sells on the cargo. Eyre and his wife Marjorie arrive at the shoemaker's shop and Marjorie lambasts the men for not working harder. When Firk and Hodge threaten to quit, Eyre scolds his wife and buys a round of beer to smooth things over. Hodge reveals the plan to buy the cargo and Eyre, getting ahead of himself, dons a velvet coat and alderman's gown. He leaves with the skipper to complete the deal. Dodger, Lincoln's servant, finds out that Lacy was staying in England to woo Rose. Dodger is paid by Lincoln to find Lacy. Hammond attempts to court Rose with Otley's blessing, but she is not receptive to his advances. He then decides to pursue a local shop girl that he knows. Otley decides to send his daughter back to their country house following this news. This allows him then to do business with Simon Eyre. Master Scott reveals to Otley that Simon Eyre has made a lot of money on the sale of the Dutch cargo. Otley promises to do business with Eyre. Dodger arrives and asks Otley if he knows where Lacy might be hiding. Otley is furious to learn that Lacy might be in London and suspects that this explains why Rose rebuffed Hammond's advances. Marjorie sends Firk to Guildhall to discover whether Eyre has been made Master Sheriff of London. Afterwards, she asks Hans and Hodge to craft a special pair of shoes for her. She then lists other accessories that she needs, including a wig and fan, despite the criticism of the men surrounding her. Ralph returns from the war, during which he has injured his leg. The shoemakers welcome him home and commiserate with him. Ralph asks about his wife Jane and learns that she is reputed to be in London. Otley welcomes Eyre and Marjorie to his home. Otley asks Marjorie to counsel Rose on her behavior, and she does so. The shoemakers arrive and perform a Morris dance. Rose instantly recognizes Lacey. After the shoemakers leave, Sybil promises Rose that she will devise a plan to marry her mistress to Hans. Hammond spies on Jane while she works alone in a clothes shop. He attempts to woo her, but she says she is already married and her husband Ralph is fighting in France. Hammond reveals that he has received word that Ralph is dead. Jane is upset upon hearing this news, prompting Hammond to propose marriage to her. Hammond does not leave until Jane promises that, if she does remarry, it will be to him. The shoemakers discuss their increasing prosperity. Sybil arrives and requests that Hans come to meet with Rose, and they depart. Hammond's servant visits the shoemakers to order a pair of shoes for his master's bride. Since they will be married the next day, he shows Ralph a shoe belonging to the woman and asks him to make a pair of the same dimensions. Ralph recognizes the shoe and realizes that the bride is his own wife, Jane. The servant leaves and Ferk arrives. The shoemakers strategize about how to interrupt Jane's wedding and reunite her with Ralph. Sybil interrupts Lacey and Rose with news that Otley approaches. Lacey falls back on his disguise and pretends to fit Rose with a shoe. Otley arrives and suspects nothing. A servant brings news that Lincoln is on his way, leaving Lacey just enough time to escape. Otley and Lincoln discuss how they intend to separate Rose and Lacey. Their plan is to find Lacey and send him to France. Sybil bursts in to reveal that Rose has eloped with a shoemaker. While Otley demands an explanation, Ferk arrives with some shoes for Rose. He reveals that Hans and Rose are planning to be married. Lincoln then realizes that Hans must be Lacey and pays Ferk to tell him at which church Rose and Hans will be married. Ferk gives Lincoln and Otley directions to the church where Hammond will marry Jane. Eyre, who is now the Lord Mayor, sends Rose and Lacey to be married with his blessing. Left alone, Simon soliloquizes about an impending visit from the king, who wishes to see the new market buildings Eyre has constructed. Eyre also looks forward to the holiday feast he is planning. Ralph, Hodge, and Ferk approach Hammond and Jane on their way to be wed. Hodge and Ferk berate Jane and then reveal that their companion is none other than Jane's husband, Ralph. Jane is elated and chooses to return to Ralph. Hammond offers money to Ralph for Jane's hand in marriage and is met with outrage. Lincoln and Otley arrive to stop the wedding, thinking Jane and Ralph are Rose and Lacey in disguise. As soon as they learn their mistake, Dodger arrives with news that Rose and Lacey are married and that Eyre intends to beg the king that Lacey be pardoned for his crimes. The church bells ring to begin the holiday and the shoemakers rejoice. The king travels towards Simon Eyre's feast and looks forward to meeting the new Lord Mayor. Eyre's men serve a feast to the apprentices of London. Marjorie reports that the king is on his way. Lacey asks Eyre to advocate for him with the king. Marjorie warns Eyre to speak politely to the king, and Eyre berates her. The king states that he is disappointed in Lacey, yet he pardons Lacey's crimes. The king also meets the shoemakers and is amused by Simon Eyre. Lincoln arrives and asks for the king to intervene. The king reports that he has already pardoned Lacey. Lincoln and Otley ask the king to annul Lacey and Rose's marriage. The king does so, then promptly remarries them. He knights Lacey, names Eyre's new building the Leadenhall, and grants Eyre's request that the sale of leather at the market be permitted 2 days per week. Eyre invites the king to partake of his banquet. The king agrees. End of the summary.